Afternoon and welcome back after lunch. I hope everybody had a good lunch. I should first of all have a disclaimer. The kind gentleman introduced me as the chairman of the Public Service Commission. The reason I'm here is nothing to do with the Public Service Commission. It's that I preceded Mr. Bilahari Kaushikan, and so when he asked me to help out at the conference, I felt I had no choice but to say yes. I have no choice. He likes to hear that I have no choice. So welcome back. In any discussion of the contemporary Middle East, the subject of oil and gas and energy almost inevitably arises. But it is nevertheless worth noting that the history of that region actually predates oil and energy, and it has a very rich culture and history. But it is certainly true that since the discovery of oil in Persia, now Iran, in the early 20th century, and in Saudi Arabia some 30 years after that, those developments have really significantly changed the human and political geography of the region. It has introduced tremendous interest in that region from outside the region, including the great powers. Recently, I think it has also allowed countries of the region to think about what role they wish to play in the world, and perhaps not only look at their own development, but the impact that they could play outside of the region. So I think it's apposite, timely that in such a meeting as today, we have a chance to think about these aspects. And I would suggest three aspects for discussion today. I am very pleased to have with me three very eminent panelists. I must start with the lady who promised me that she would be here, but she's ill. So firstly, I want to thank her for being very responsible and staying at home and not coming here, but also for volunteering to participate online. So thank you, Ms. Liu Xiaowei. And the reason why I thought these three panelists would be of interest today is because of the three sort of areas that I think we should think about. I mean, firstly, set against the latest developments in the world, the terrible things that are happening in Ukraine, the review and the refashioning of supply chains in energy is obviously a very topical subject. Coming after the several years of pandemic, which has itself had its own effects on supply chains, I think it really merits a relook at how the new trading patterns, the new ways in which pricing will affect the rest of us in the world, how that will pan out. So that, I think, is one area that is worth talking about. The second area, of course, is for some time now, we have been in an energy transition, moving towards decarbonization to low, or some say even no, carbon energy. And whilst this transition, I believe, is still in progress, we want to know what the impact of recent events are going to be. How are they going to affect the energy transition that we all hope will lead to a more livable world? And I think the third area, which, since this is a Middle East Institute, we should also look at what the impact is on the people of the region, because the availability of resources in the region has meant the possibility of really far-reaching plans to transition the economies and the social systems of the region. But what have the recent redevelopments meant for some of these plans? I think we should also be cognizant of, and would be merit some discussion. So perhaps on those 3 points, I could start by I will introduce them as they speak. Our first speaker, Mr. Adnan Shihab Eldin. He's a senior visiting research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies in the UK. He's a member of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and he's also a board member of the Carney Energy Transition Institute, Netherlands. He was a former acting Secretary General and Director of Research at OPEC. So, Dr. Adnan, I would hand the floor to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first, let me thank the Middle East Institute for giving me this opportunity to be with you today. And I originally prepared a set of slides that I was hoping to use some of them in my talk, but I decided against that in the interest of brevity and also to make it a bit more smoother flow for the 15 minutes that I'm allotted. But these slides are available with the organizer. If any one of you interested, I was assured they can make them available to you. I think what I really wants to say is that maybe by setting the scene, as Mr. Chairman said, we are indeed going through an energy transition. And that transition is supposed to lead us to no carbon or low carbon emission from the energy system that we will reach. And according to all of the studies, it's 2050 we should reach net zero emission, but that's not assured. So the direction of the transition is well set. Everybody agreed to it. Everybody signed the agreement, doing something, but there is doubt whether we are at pace. And there is more doubt whether we will get there in time to avoid some of the catastrophic consequences according to some of the studies. So that's the first point I wanted to make right in the beginning. And second point, remind ourselves that energy transition from wood to coal, coal to oil, and oil now to energy low carbon, carbon neutral takes time. It took about 50 years until it became very clear that we moved from coal to oil. And we're trying to do this whole transition within 20, 30 years to avoid something happening. And this transition in particular, different than the previous transition. The difference is that we are now moving into what's called low density, low power, low density in energy and power in the new system. Renewable, we know that it's low density. Now, of course, a lot of people believe that this system should try to have all low carbon energy technologies and policies, and some other people have already preset mind what it should be. It should be only renewable or mostly renewable. And I think here I would like to make one statement right from the beginning. I think it's not correct to try to dictate a priori without proof to everybody that you should, each one of us and every one of us should put all of our eggs in one basket. We should be careful. We should try to follow every possible low carbon emission, low emission technology available to us, or we can develop in the future. So that's really the first point I wanted to start with. And I wanted to say, if we are we on track or not on track? Clearly, according to all studies, from the IPCC most recent study, the International Panel on Climate Change, to indicators from the World Energy Council, from the Climate Action Tracker, we are not on track. Even the best countries that are putting a lot of effort in European countries like Germany, European Union, they are not on track to reach net zero emission by 2050. So we have to look for alternatives ways, not to follow a preset model that is not likely to get us there. Even those countries that are advocating that solution alone are not getting there. And we saw that happening after the Ukraine war, when the European countries scrambled to get energy security, which they had ignored for a long time. Suddenly they found themselves in need to replace the gas from Russia and the oil from Russia, and they brought back even coal. And not even that, many of the countries in Europe that were against nuclear, Germany, Italy, 2 weeks ago, the parliament voted to bring back nuclear as an option. The European Union Parliament voted to accept nuclear option as a sustainable power system. This was unthinkable before Ukraine. So what does this prove? It proves that there is no one prescription for everybody for all times. That is an important message. And now we are heading toward COP28 that will take place in the Emirate in trying to address the remaining issues that have not been negotiated yet related to policies to make sure that climate change is being addressed, but at the same time, what are the energy policies globally that will get us there? And clearly, even in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt last year, we saw a widening gap between the North and the South. The North was insisting that everybody has to get on board on the pre-prescribed path that advocated by the IEA in Paris, which says that renewable is about the only way to go, and if there is a little bit left, then you can do it by some other techniques. What is now becoming clear that this will not get us there. What will get us there is to make sure that we be open in our mind, in our actions, in our policies, to develop and deploy all available options, whether they are nuclear, whether they are blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, including possibilities. If everything else fails, and we cannot get to net zero emission using technology alone, supply technology alone, then we need to resort to what's called the nuclear option, not nuclear power. Nuclear option means that we have to go back and take the CO2 from the atmosphere, that we put it in the first place in the atmosphere. Because we have a limited budget. I had in my slides, but I don't want to show the slides, but if you want. We have limited carbon budget remaining. And if we follow the most stringent policies in order to get to net zero emission, we have, and keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, as the IPCC is suggesting to us, that means that the available carbon dioxide we still allowed to put in the atmosphere is very limited. And it's going to be put there by those who are consuming CO2 the most, which is the industrial country plus some of the rising countries like China and India and some of the Gulf countries. But the rest of the world, Latin America and Africa and Asia, billions that don't have access to power, they will be denied that carbon budget that's remaining. So that's the second important point that I wanted to stress out. Now I turn my attention to what is the MENA countries, the GCC countries, doing about this energy transition. And as I told you earlier, they are basically faced with many challenges. Main challenge for them is that how do they manage this transition which affects their income and prosperity? Because most of these countries depend heavily on income generated from export of oil and gas, whether it's crude or products. And obviously they have signed on to the UNFCCC, 1992, they have signed on to all of the COPs, the Paris Agreement, but they have to find a path that balances their commitment to the Paris Agreement and their commitment to prosperity in their own countries. And there is a path. There is a path that they are following. And that path that they are following, first of all, their strategy must take into consideration that no matter what they do, there will always be surprises. There will be shocks, Ukraine war, COVID, and these shocks affect their income to a large extent. And they have to be ready to adjust on the short term, medium term, adjust their policies to take care of these shocks. But more importantly to them, they have to develop a strategy for the long term when we will have a system, maybe not necessarily 2050, 2060, where all of the energy sources will have to be carbon-free. And so they follow two approaches. One approach is to make use of the abundant endowment of renewables available to them. Because if you know Middle East, Gulf countries and North Africa, you know solar energy is abundant, and as well as in wind energy on the coastal line. So the first thing they do is to do that, to make maximum use of the abundant renewable energy sources available. And by the way, they started doing that long before climate change and Paris Agreement. I tell you, in Kuwait in 1984, we inaugurated the first 1 megawatt thermal power station in the world in the desert of Kuwait with German technology. Saudi Arabia did the same thing. The Emirate took the lead in the early 2000s. They set up Masdar, and they started investing heavily in renewable energy because they saw that's the future as a hedge against losing an important source of income. So taking advantage of renewable is very important for all of the MENA countries, whether it's the Gulf countries, the Levant, North Africa, and Egypt. And you take advantage of the renewable first to meet part of your demand, but the other part is that you convert it possibly to a fuel that you can export, for example, blue hydrogen. And now blue hydrogen is in demand. I know it's in demand in Asia, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, because Japan and Asian countries, they look at hydrogen as a substitute for liquid fuels to fuel their industry. And a source of that can come from the Gulf countries, could come from North Africa, and can go to Europe from North Africa. And already Aramco, ADNOC, many oil companies have started experimenting with production of blue hydrogen and green hydrogen and bilateral agreement with Japan and many Asian countries. So renewables can be one way to meet the domestic demand, but at the same time could be a source of diversification while staying in the same business. The second is to focus on how can we contribute to decarbonization the fossil fuels that we have. We have large assets of fossil fuels. If we can decarbonize it, make it as good as renewable, why not? And that's what precisely is happening. You see a lot of programs in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in some of the African countries like Algeria, focusing on carbon sequestration pilot projects, focusing on converting oil into cleaner product and taking the CO2 that could be emitted or is emitted in the process of using it, putting it underground. So that points out to a centrality of our future strategy will depend on two things: renewable development, and that's already taking place. In fact, you know, renewable solar energy in the Gulf countries right now, when the sun is shining, it's about the cheapest source of power. And that applies to many parts of the world. But of course, when the sun is not shining, solar energy is about the most expensive power source. Why? Because if there is no sun, you need to have backup, you need to have batteries, and that's not available. So that's the reason why when you go to these COP conferences and you hear countries like Germany insisting that everybody should adopt the German model of pushing only renewable from wind and solar, you turn around and tell them, what happened in your case? Germany ended up right now in the world having the highest cost of electricity. It's fine. That suits them. That's fine. No problem. And we will do the same if it suits us. But what suits the developing countries in general is to follow an approach where you look at every possible way to meet the Paris Agreement goal, not just fix on one aspect of it. So the second part of our strategy is to look at decarbonization. And the strategy itself has to face a number of challenges. One of the main challenges we don't know about is we don't know what the demand for oil and gas, decarbonize or not decarbonize. Some of the projections vary by as much as 100%. If you look, I had in my slide, if you look at forecasts from IEA, from OPEC, from IRENA, from International Energy Agency, you see variances of 100% in oil demand. It could be as much as 20 million barrels, could be as high as 100 million barrels. That's a difference of over 80 million barrels. That's almost the same level of demand currently. The total demand for oil currently is about close to 100 million barrels. Same thing applies with gas. Renewable will continue to grow from very low, less than 10%, to possibly 50%, possibly 30% share. Nuclear will have to come into the picture, especially with SMRs, small modular reactors, which offer a new way, safer way, more versatile way, based on modularity. So instead of building 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant, you may have 5 smaller ones, 200 megawatt. And that may suit certain countries like Singapore, for example. Singapore has been thinking about nuclear many decades. But the problem for Singapore is that they don't know where to locate a 1,000 megawatt reactor. It's a big problem. Like Kuwait, we tried it 3 times, and we couldn't find a place to put a reactor of 1,000, but if you have a modular reactor. So that's one approach. So let me now, since time is important, you can sum up the strategies that are being followed by the Gulf countries in what's called the circular carbon economy that was proposed by Saudi Arabia to the G20 in Riyadh in 2020. And that's based on the following concept. You have to do 4 things, or you should explore doing 4 things. Reduce emissions by renewable, by nuclear, by energy efficiency. That's 1R, reduce. But you should also find a way to reuse the carbon dioxide. For example, in foods and beverages, in enhanced oil recovery, industrial application. Recycle the carbon dioxide into chemicals, into carbon fuels, and so on. And ultimately remove. And that's very important. Remove is to take away what you put in the first place. And I say this is very important because technology on the supply side, I mentioned it, involves decarbonized fuels, nuclear, but that's not sufficient according to the IPCC latest report. It's not going to be sufficient, and it's not going to be sufficient by a long distance. So what do? You take CO2 from the atmosphere and you put it underground. And there is technologies. In fact, there are companies, 2 companies in Europe and Canada. These 2 companies raised $800 million of venture capital funds to expand. Simply to expand into what? From producing a little bit of CO2 from the atmosphere for bottling and to putting it in bottles and for drinks, beverages, into making it into direct air capture and becoming a business. And here the Gulf countries are poised to benefit from that because we have huge capacity for storage of the CO2, both storage of CO2 domestically produced and consumed, or for export, or to bring the CO2 from outside where they don't have, because for direct air capture to work, you need 2 things. You need to be able to capture the CO2, but you need to find a matching place to store it. And not every country in the world has that possibility. Now, the cost is important for the cost of CO2 capture and storage. But if you think about it, the industrial countries for 150 years, they were able to put CO2 in the atmosphere and benefit without paying any penalty for the CO2 they put in the atmosphere. So they have accumulated a huge amount of wealth. Good for them, no problem. But now is the time for them is to, what I would like to quote from my friend Fatih Birol in his statement about 2 weeks ago. He said the oil and gas industry has to face the moment of truth at the COP28. And he said it has to basically clean up its act. And he's correct. He's correct in that. But thinking about it, you must also say that the industrial countries, COP28 is their moment of truth because they have to clean up their act, which as 150 years ago, until now, they have benefited from it. And this is not my words, this is the word of the IPCC that says this has to be done. The question, at what level? Well, currently we cannot do it at gigaton per year levels because you really need to reach about 5 gigaton per year or 8 gigaton per year level. Currently, all of the direct air captures, CCS, is at the level of 50 million tons per year. So you really need to go almost by a factor of 1,000. luckily, some of the industrial countries like the United States has taken the lead. There are proposals now in the US to finance direct air capture by something like $3 billion a year for 10 years in order to reach a capacity of about 1 gigaton per year by 2060. In one of the slides I had, I will show that we have emitted into the atmosphere, the industrial countries and the developing countries and China. And by the way, China right now, all of the sort of eyes in China is being accused as being the most emitter of CO2. Of course, it's correct. China in 2023 probably will emit the most amount of CO2. But if you look at it per capita, and if you look at it more importantly, cumulatively, the total CO2 that was being put by China in the atmosphere is less than 10%. The rest of it is coming mostly from the industrial countries. And so if we have put out 2,500 or 2,500 gigatons into the atmosphere over, how many of those we have to take out? Well, it depends how successful we are in decarbonizing, in renewable. The less successful we are, the more we have to take from the atmosphere. And so the good estimate right now is that we need to reach about 5 to 10 gigawatt per year, and that will depend mostly, should fall on the shoulders of the industrial countries that put most of the CO2 into the atmosphere. My final point, and I will conclude here, one talks about the impact of Russian invasion to Ukraine, and it was discussed in previous panel, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but I will just say that it became very clear as a result of the Ukraine war, irrespective of where your position is on the war. And of course, all of us are in the position that we don't like wars and we don't accept invasions and what have you. But put that aside, the impact is that it pointed out that energy security becomes important and you change your policy according to that. And we saw what happened in Europe. They changed their policy as a result of the Ukraine war. And now they put sanctions on Russia, rightly so, but the Russian oil is finding its way back to Europe because Russia is now selling at a discount to India, and the Indian refineries are refining the crude, the Russian crude, selling it back as product to Europe. And some of that's happening in the Middle East. So the Middle East is also adjusting because oil is fungible. So no matter what you do about it, even gas is becoming fungible. Now, second point I want to conclude with is that there are strong implications about this sort of expanding gap between North and South. It happened in COP27, and it's likely to happen in COP28. We're already seeing an campaign of attack on the United Arab Emirates leadership and presidency, unfounded, because the UAE is an exemplary model of clean energy with Masdar and what have you, including the president of COP28, Dr. Sultan al-Jaber. He was behind Masdar, he was behind IRENA. So I think if this conflict continues, it's not good for anybody. I think what we need is to cooperate, put our heads together, and make the best out of it, make best of this opportunity. If we miss this opportunity, I think we will find ourselves delayed later on. I will stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan. If I may just a few comments, and then maybe I will invite the second speaker. I will invite is Ms. Liu Xiaowei. But Dr. Adnan, I think, has taken us through the possible technologies. I would say, on balance, you are a techno-optimist. So you believe that out there the solution exists, but it's not one solution for everybody. I think you're also saying that we need to accept that the world runs on more than just carbon reduction. There are short-term security implications which force public policy changes and adaptation, and indeed, I mean, even in Europe, the view on nuclear has changed. I mean, I think Germany has shut down its last nuclear plant, but Finland has started up an enormous one. So it's really quite telling. But I think one area perhaps you have not covered, and perhaps Ms. Liu Xiaowei can cover, is, I think, Dr. Adnan, you've talked very much about top-down and big organization solutions, very much on the supply side. We know that human behavior can frustrate the most ambitious government plans. And so how do we view what is happening in the world and how consumer habits and behaviors might change and how that might affect the future? Perhaps we could have a discussion on that later. Perhaps Xiaowei can also talk about that. And maybe one point, maybe for Mr. Tan, is that the new trading patterns, I think, are reflective of the new realities in geopolitics. And some of that, which you referred to, I think, in a very neutral way, may be with us for quite some time. I don't see Russian oil in Europe for quite some time. Yep. At least not directly. So what does that mean in terms of the new market realities? But okay, let me maybe now invite Ms. Liu Xiaowei. Ms. Liu joined the World Energy Council on 1st April 22, so just last year, as Director of Special Projects in Asia. She's looking to build the visibility of the World Energy Council and seek commercial opportunities for it across Asia. World Energy Council, for those of you who don't know, is a 100-year-old institution, probably the oldest of its nature in the world. Prior to this, she worked for Shell both in China and outside of China. And currently, she also works for the Conference Board, for the Asia Communications Lead Council, and she's also on the advisory board of GGEF, which is a social enterprise promoting sustainability. So, Ms. Liu, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, MEI, for the invite. Apology that I wouldn't be able to join you in person due to the flu. I hope I come through this screen with a clearer voice and better with a clearer mind. And I would like to thank our prestigious first panel, Dr. Anand, for setting the context and even for mentioning the World Energy Council. As our chairman mentioned briefly, we are probably the oldest and the most independent energy institution. It was formed 100 years ago in 1924. In the time of crisis, right after World War I and right post-pandemic. Yeah? For 100 years, we have supported increasingly diverse energy societies in leading with and learning from each other. And we have learned a lot from operating through the different era of energy transition. I'm glad Dr. Anna already mentioned transitions of energy has always been there in the last 100 years, from a wood to today, going to renewable. And, the energy role in society changed quite a bit from the onset, energy for peace, then post-war years, energy for prosperity. Now we're talking about sustainability. And we term this energy for people and planet. So as we look for the next 100 years in energy, we're working with a much more focused vision of humanizing energy. As our chairman mentioned, the consumer dimension, as well as putting people front and center in this transition. I may talk about that later, maybe in the next session, but let me now focus a bit more about the insights we have about Middle East. And I have to make a disclaimer, I'm no expert about the region, Middle East. What I'm talking about is relying on the insights from the energy transition work we do at the council. And these are, the energy pulse that we do with energy leaders across the globe, the issue monitors, as well as the energy trilemma, where we measure how countries' energy policy addressing security, sustainability, and accessibility. So all in all, we all know that Middle East in oil and gas, still play an essential role for them in both economy and trade, but they do grappling with stability at speed. This means, the role of oil and gas is still important over the midterm, but the hydrocarbon has a declining role in the longer term. So let me first of all share, what we found in the Energy Pulse survey. This was just released last month in April. Overall, globally, across the 6 continents and over 70 countries that responded to the survey, that people are concerned mostly energy security, very much national interest. And the other thing is about green technology arm race. Yeah, everyone is jumping to that wagon. But they also consider this becoming the greatest obstacle to energy transition. So for Middle East, there are certain things slightly different, maybe more making, what worries the energy leaders in their region. Number one, they are most concerned in being the greatest obstacle is the cost of capital and access to investment to speed up the energy transition. So the investment, the cost is being one. And when asked about, what is the critical implementation gap to accelerate energy transition, they talk about aligning financing system with sustainable development to redirect investment to drive fast transitions and renewable at scale. Yeah. And globally, they would like to see a more inclusive governance system, as well as, breakthrough technology. These are the sort of top of mind gaps that they would like to see to accelerate the transition. From the, what would be a better, matrix to measure transition? Affordability, they would really like to see more connecting the price, full system cost, and the value in use. For accessibility, even though Gulf countries actually top our trilemma index on accessibility because of the abundance of energy, they still wanted to see close the gap to electricity and develop better a new matrix to measure modern energy access. When asked about how do we, redesign energy for people and the planet, basically, sustainability, their most focused area will be reducing carbon intensity of energy, and this including renewable at scale, as well as low carbon fuels. And they also wanted to reducing energy intensity, which means efficiency and system efficiency conservation are important. So these two are equally important. And of course, as Dr. Anand earlier mentioned about their circular carbon economy initiative, there's 4 R's. In this case, they also felt remove. This means, CCUS, capture, as well as nature-based solutions. These are also important for, a more sustainable energy future. Interesting enough, when we talk about governance level to drive maybe a faster, fairer transition in the region, like most regions, they do mention national governments play an important role, but they are the only region that ranked multilateral organization playing equally, if not more important role in driving faster and fairer transition. That's a quite interesting dimension. So this is about the recent Pulse survey. I will quickly also share a bit of a perspective of our issue monitor. Again, another tool that we use for our community to monitor, transition and the actions. This one, the data was a little bit aged. It was like 18 months ago, post COP26, released just before the Ukraine war. But still, when I look at it today, I still felt some relevance and maybe echoing some of the points discussed at the beginning of today in the various sessions. So the monitor actually provides 2 dimensions. One is about the action priorities, the countries or regions reacting to progress energy transition. And the other axis is critical uncertainties. where they feel, the areas of concern, and how have they looked at it over the time. So the last issue monitor that we published beginning of 2022, just before the Ukraine war, in the Middle East, of course, they continue to having the overall map with the global map. But for them, the commodity price and the geopolitics are rising from being an action priority to the critical uncertainty. Remember, this was before Ukraine war. Geopolitics rising until an area of worry, moving from action. And overall, the commodity price topped the list of critical uncertainty. So for the region, if you ask about what is the greatest uncertainty for them, commodity price, and then followed by economic growth and geopolitics. And this shift we have seen since the last one was 2021. And then the other thing was hydrogen increased in the uncertainty axis. We earlier talked about the energy mix for the region going forward. And lastly, is really around the views about renewable energy, energy efficiency, land, water availability remain an action priority, which is great to see. The focus on renewable efficiency as well as other sustainability issues like land and water. For energy trilemma is a tool that we developed, and I think now it's becoming a global language. People talk about security, where you look at a country's capacity to meet their current and future energy demand, and also withstand and bounce back swiftly from system shocks with minimal disruption to supply. And sustainability, we look at the country's energy system towards mitigating or avoiding potential environmental harm and climate change impacts. The equity and access is more the ability to provide universal access to affordable, fairly priced, and abundant energy for both domestic and commercial use. And of course, you will not be surprised in our latest energy trilemma index assessing. Fossil fuel, of course, continue to drive the focus in Middle East, and energy equity remains strengths of the region given their abundance in supply. And however, we have to recognize that this energy equity in Middle East is a byproduct of subsidy. And there is a question about sustainability in the longer term. And of course, the trilemma also shows the key leaders in the region are very keen to diversify their energy mix. So in the latest conversation we had with our member committee in the Middle East, despite whether you are a supply country or in a market where you have to import your energy in Middle East, that's Gulf as well as Levant states, as we have both members in both those countries, energy security is top of mind for leaders in the region for different reasons. I'll just stop there, Chairman, and maybe we come back to address other issues during the next session. Thank you.
Okay, so I thought I heard you say that you were optimistic about the possibilities for deeper cooperation in the region on the aspects of renewables. And I think, if that were the case, indeed some of the maybe the latest developments in geopolitics and the Middle East, where I think countries in the region may be deciding that they have to take more of their own of the destiny in their own hands, might actually drive some of these opportunities for cooperation. So it may be positive in terms of the direction that you are painting. But there are, of course, social and political pressures, if nothing less, just from the growing populations. The Middle East actually has growing populations and young populations. So the ability to meet these aspirations on the part of the people who are in government is going to be one of the key aspects of whether we have a peaceful energy transition. The other point I'd like to make is that, of course, the introduction of renewables in the Middle East is not only, I think, good for the world in terms of reducing the carbon, but it actually frees up more flexibility for the countries in the Middle East and North Africa to influence the rest of the world through the exports of fossil fuels. And the exports of fossil fuels is a well-trodden path by which countries in the Middle East do affect the rest of the world, in which they exercise a degree of influence. And I think, aside from the most rabid, I think, environmentalists, I think we will be with fossil fuels for the next couple of decades at least. And therefore, it does make sense for MENA to actually have in hand a flexibility in terms of fossil fuels. So, having said that, how will those trends translate into trade patterns? So perhaps I could invite our next speaker, who is Mr. Tan Chin Hui. He's the CEO Asia Pacific for Trafigura Private Limited. He joined Trafigura in 2016 as the CEO for Asia Pacific for the group. But previously, he was the founder actually of the Asian operations of the Apollo Global Management, which is the alternative investment fund. And before that, he was managing director at the hedge fund Amaranth Advisors. So in Singapore, he does a lot of public service. He has served on the Emerging Stronger Task Force, and he's currently chairman of the SG TradeX, which is the digital infrastructure that facilitates trusted, secure sharing of data between supply chain ecosystem partners. So, Mr. Tan, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lee. Thank you, Chair, Ambassador Bilahari, Michelle, and the MEI team for having me. I tried to make it interesting after hearing from the two speakers before your coffee break. So I will divide my talk into three perspectives. Like the first speaker, Dr. Anand, he talked about the fungibility of oil. And I also like to talk about the fungibility of money. When money, just like oil and just like talent, go to places where they're best looked after. So when we talk about Middle East, we should today also talk about the flow of money. Second, I'd like to talk about the peace dividend that Middle East is enjoying and the mindset change that I observe doing business in Middle East. And finally, I'd like to talk the last part about Far East and the Middle East, the cooperation going forward, and why a firm like Trafigura is now here moving the HQ into Singapore. So the first perspective is, as some of you may know, I was in private equity before I switched career. And the GCC sovereign wealth funds, all of them were my customer, right? The KIA, QIA, PIF, ADIA, General Reserve Fund of Oman, etc. So I have a sense about how they do things, and I must say that the next few years is Middle East era. I mean, not only they have transformed in terms of how they manage their wealth, with the flow of money, they're now able to influence beyond, way beyond many of our other countries' sovereign wealth fund. And let me explain, I'll give you some numbers. In 2022 alone, the sovereign wealth fund of the Middle East have invested $51 billion. The global sovereign wealth fund market is about 5.5 trillion, and yet 40% of all these global sovereign wealth funds are from the Middle East, and they are growing because of the oil price budgeting, and they're coming in. More importantly, they are also working together quietly, which is unheard of. Right? So, for example, what I do know is that ADIA, which is Abu Dhabi, PIF, which is Saudi, and Mutalakat, which is Bahrain, are opening up a joint office in Bahrain and looking for things together like in aluminium. Right? So this mindset change about working together also is one part of the peace dividend portion which I want to talk about. So for example, ADIA is the largest Middle East sovereign wealth fund, $710 billion. Last year alone, they invested $26 billion. More than PIF, which is more well-known, of $20 billion. So what kind of things they are investing at the moment, right? Those who follow football will know PIF is 80% of Newcastle. The deputy PM of UAE is Man City. And of course, some of you who were a football fan who had gone to Qatar World Cup, you cannot not be impressed by what the Qatari has built over a short time. After this, I'm going to Korea because I've been, for my family office, I'm investing in Korea. And I come across them, PIF in entertainment companies in Korea. I heard from PIF that they want 1% of the GDP in entertainment. They are investor in Live Golf, who many of you were here, saw them last month. They were investor in Live Nation, doing concerts. So I think that is a trend that is going on quietly, as they work together, looking at strategic assets. And of course, that will also include green energy, if they want to look at it. Right, I think that is very important. Just now, Dr. Anand talked about what Dr. Sultan Jabbar has been doing, not just in ACNOR, but in Mazda. Right, those who may not know him will know that Mazda is investing into 100 gigawatt renewable power. So while there were parliamentary criticism from the West about him presiding COP28, but let's not forget as well, the oil producer are also part of the solution. So I actually agree with Dr. Anand's discussion earlier. What is also more important, which I talked about just now, was the peace dividend, is also the mindset. For those who has been going down to Middle East, today, if you go to Dubai, you feel more welcome. The government official will take out a note and paper, try to write down what you're trying to say, a bit like Singapore, right? The EDB of the world when we first known. Why the immigration officer also smiling, right? All this small thing tells me that it's changing. And you could see on the numbers, the IPO in Middle East, GCC, MENA alone, just 20 IPO in fourth quarter 2022 is $7.3 billion. Just 20 IPO. Give you another perspective. All of Southeast Asia IPO combined for the full year, comparing with just one quarter in Middle East, is the same number. And there are 163 IPOs in Southeast Asia. But thanks to Ernest, my colleague, who is helping me to gather all this data. You can see that the money flow is being concentrated quietly, and beyond the obvious, the football clubs, right? They are actually investing a lot. It's not so obvious, because they have been doing this for a while, right? But I do see them coming into this region in a more sustainable way. And part of it is my second point on peace dividend. Just like Asia, we have enjoyed peace for the last decade, so many years of decade post-Vietnam War. And this helped as well. The Abraham Accord was mentioned by previous speakers. China, USA, competition in Middle East is also being mentioned. But what is not mentioned is among themselves, right? Even among the region, right? Last week, Bahrain and Lebanon signed a peace treaty, right? They're normalizing relationship. We saw the airline flights being full between Israel and Gulf Air in Bahrain, for example, Etihad. But all this facilitate business, facilitate communication, and again facilitate mindset change. I know it's not easy. I know they are slightly different right, from region to region, but clearly the way I see it in my vantage point in Trafigura, I think things are changing. And the last part is, what do we do when we talk about Far East and the Middle East, right? So my company is one of the largest company in the world. We are privately owned. We are top 10 largest outside of USA, according to Fortune Global 500 ranking in terms of revenue. Of course, Saudi Aramco, Shell, that Mr. Lee was in before, and other companies were among the top largest company post this era. But more importantly, I think things are moving is, so for example, when Trafigura moved our HQ to Singapore, today we do not just need to wait for London time zone to open to quote insurance quotes for my ships, right? The same will go for other things as well, right? What is important is what Ms. Liu just now talked. talk about is the cost of capital. The cost of capital is relatively low today in Middle East versus the rest of the world. And Asia as well. Asia is flooded with money. One of the key benefiting point for Traffico to move our HQ here is that today Asia banks and Middle Eastern banks are more than European banks in trade finance, which in the past has been a European phenomenon. Today is Asia and Middle East, at least for my company, the bulk of the trade finance flow. So as we look east, I would like to suggest that Asia is about trade, it's about business. It's very difficult to mix human rights and politics with economics. So let's stay this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. You have a more upbeat, most upbeat presentation, discussion of the three panelists. But perhaps we can also, in the discussion section, talk about some of the obstacles that might come in the way of the future that you pick. And what is it that we might have to do, perhaps from a Singapore perspective, that might help to smoothen the way to a better outcome, rather than let the obstacles stop us. So that brings me to the point where we can invite members of the audience. I don't know if there are others who are online who wish to. There's a gentleman here. You can, maybe the gentleman first and then the lady. I don't know where the mics are. It's just coming up. So in the front corner here. Okay. Okay, the lady first then. Sorry. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the speakers.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi. I'm a research fellow at the Middle East Institute. Mm-hmm. My question is for Dr. Adnan. As you know, I do my research on the climate and the environment, and I focus on the Gulf Arab state. And, okay, so you don't hear me. Right. So, yes, thanks for pointing out the picture of the energy transition in the Middle East or in the Gulf Arab states specifically. As you mentioned, there is a momentum in terms of undertaking or being involved in the global energy transition. And from my research, I can agree with that, because if we look at the Gulf Arab states like 10 years ago, for example, in terms of renewable, the installment capacity of renewable is relatively small. But most recently, the installment capacity has increased, and now we have 5 Gulf countries who set net zero target emissions. Moving ahead, and you mentioned that there is no one size that fits all. So moving ahead, what are the key challenges that you think the Gulf state will face to achieve the net zero targets? But that said, I think like the political will is, at least it's already there at the moment. And then the other question is actually the moderator asked, but it hasn't been answered. It's on the regional cooperation. Do you also, maybe this is for all speakers as well, do you think that the regional cooperation in the energy transition for the Gulf country does make sense? And then I have also, if the audience allow me, I have another question. The third question is also for Dr. Adnan. It's about the economic case for the energy transition for the Gulf Arab states. Because as you mentioned, the Gulf Arab states depend on the oil revenues, despite the efforts to make economic diversification. As we know, even to address the climate change issues, like the water scarcity, the food security issues, we need to depend on the revenues that comes from the oil. And this is why, perhaps for the short term, the decarbonization of the hydrocarbon sector does make sense for the Gulf Arab states. And also, I think, even for the energy transition itself, the Gulf countries will still need to depend on the revenues from oil as well to fund those projects to an extent. And have said that, I think the Gulf countries are also not similar on how they adopt the energy transition. So my question is, how do you think the Gulf countries can make a competitive advantage being involved in the energy transition from an economic point of view? Thank you.
I must admit that the first part of the first question I missed. You said, what are the, and then I missed the word, the key word. What are the what in the first question? Just the first, you said what are, and I missed it.
If you don't mind, the key challenges.
Key challenges.
That face the Gulf countries. Thank you.
I thought so. Yeah, briefly, I don't want to take too much time, but clearly the key challenge, in my judgment, is how to balance between elongating and optimizing the returns from your assets, while at the same time ensuring you build resilience, perhaps through diversification, but accept at the same time, which is always the case when you are trying to reduce the risks, you have to pay a premium. You know, you go to an insurance company and you insure your car, you pay a premium. You don't know whether your car will be in an accident or not. And that's what happens. So you have to sort of do some kind of a trade-off. Do you want to just maximize the return from your oil and gas and push ahead with investment in oil and gas with the hope that oil and gas will stay for 2, 3, 4, 5 decades? Or do you want to hedge your bets and invest in renewable, invest in carbon sequestration, participate in the international dialogue? All of this costs money. And that money is the cost of building resilience. Diversification of the economy, whether you diversify into industry that depends on oil and gas, that gives you better advantage. But if you diversify into industries that don't depend on inputs from oil and gas, you improve your resilience, but you may lose your competitiveness, which is a price you have to pay. So to me, the key challenge is this. And then you talked about regional cooperation. But before I go to regional cooperation, engaging actively in the international dialogue, and not to let the international dialogue about climate change and energy transition be pulled away by perhaps special interests which are fighting for their own interest. No problem with that. But you should be fighting about your interest with, not just with words, but with actions, with policies, with investments, aiming to move with everybody to the same goal, which is to save the world from ending up going above 1.5 degrees, because science is telling us that could be very dangerous. On regional cooperation among the Gulf countries, briefly, there is plenty of room. Unfortunately, so far, until about a few years ago, each country has went about its own business. And for good reasons, because these countries sort of have different backgrounds. They are starting from low development, so they go with the best technology, with the best partners, whether in renewable, which we did in Kuwait in the 80s, whether it's in nuclear, the Emirate went with Korea. There was, for example, there was a project in 2007 to have a regional nuclear power program for the Gulf countries. It didn't work out. Why it didn't work out? Because, as I explained, each country comes from a different background, different interest. Now that we are maturing, I see more room for cooperation. And I think they're beginning to see political conversions of new type of leadership. You know, the Middle East, I am old enough to remember the Middle East in the 50s, when we have different ideologies, Nasser, Arab nationalism, all of this did not work, failed. And so people are continue always to look for new ways to improve their, well-being and I think Ibtisam mentioned that in her intervention. Now we're seeing new type of leadership coming up, and the leadership has shifted from the Levant and Egypt, maybe to the Gulf, maybe Saudi Arabia and Emirate. So will that last, or whether we will continue to evolve and looking for new leadership? I don't know. I think it looks promising. It looks promising for the time being, especially what I see in Saudi Arabia is happening is amazing. I was there just a month ago. So the short answer to that, yes, regional cooperation makes a lot of sense, but it will take political decision at the decision maker. I think the people themselves are ready for it, because they are sort of a similar background, similar culture, what have you. It just takes the political leadership. Hopefully, this will happen very soon. And the last question, you talked about the economic case for energy transition when we need, for example, thermal energy for desalination, as I understood you from our power plant. Is that my understanding, or did I miss it? I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the third question properly. No, yeah, I think the microphone can be rushed to you. Just to be sure, just give me a hint. What was the third question exactly?
Okay, so it's about the revenues that we can generate from renewables, for example, might not be at the same level as the revenues that we generate from oil exports.
Yes, of course. The revenue we will generate, at least on paper right now, doesn't look as good, but 10, 20, 30 years from now, if we combine renewable returns and renewable, not just for domestic, and create an opportunity for export of oil and gas until oil and gas is no longer needed without mitigation. Because you could still export oil and gas beyond 2050 net zero emission from resources, huge resources we have, by doing carbon capture from the air a priori. So for every barrel of oil you export, you stamp it carbon-free, because you have already captured the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide that will be emitted from that. And then with blockchain, you can follow it up. But of course, it's less profitable than just selling the crude oil without having to pay the penalty of capturing the carbon from the atmosphere. But there is no escape from, as I said, it's trade-offs. So yes, I don't think we will have enough revenues from one source alone, but we will have, if we put all of these sources alone, it would look more resilient and more reliable than continuing to depend only on oil and gas export without mitigation.
So if I may just add to that, I mean, a lot of that is predicated on alignment of definitions and regulations. So I think how Scope 2 and Scope 3 will actually emerge, I think will determine very much how much you can actually rely on trading to solve this problem. There's a gentleman up front here. Sorry, Anthony. He did raise his hand earlier. And then we'll come back to Anthony.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Anish Mishra. I'm a PhD candidate from Heidelberg University, Germany. My question is that the title of this presentation was Between the New Oil Boom and Climate Change. So I'd like to talk about something before the oil boom. Is that if you look at the pandemic, during the peak of the pandemic, the oil price dropped to below $40 per barrel, and then after the Russian invasion of, after the Ukraine war, it increased to above the $100 mark. Now, when the oil price was down, there was talk in the Middle East, in the countries of the Middle East, about a post-oil economy, about economic diversification, and then the era of earning revenues through exporting oil is over. To be fair, the Middle East didn't anticipate the invasion of Ukraine and the oil boom after the pandemic. Now, since the oil price have increased, what has happened to all those talk about the post-oil economy and the post-oil economy and economic diversifications? I think many projects were also discussed, and since the oil price have gone up, it seems that the Middle East is not so keen on going to this post-oil economy or economic diversification to earn revenues from sectors besides oil. I do understand that in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, much attempts have already been done, but it seems that this thing has come to a stop, maybe because there's no need for it anymore.
Would you like to take this, or Mr. Tan, would you like to, any sense on investments in such? I don't think the investments have started in some of these discussions.
Maybe I try this, because obviously it's also a timing issue. Why there's a timing, why it's short-term versus long-term, why, and when you time your investment. Today, in 2022, developing economies, right, they only receive about 20% of the clean tech investments, right, whereas most of that is going to the developed world. So again, it's also how you do the allocation. If you understand how budgeting is done, I was in the government parliamentary committee here, so I learned, and then I see other Middle East countries how they do it. They put down a budget for oil. Right? In Australia, you'll be beyond oil, you'll be all the metals group, right? And then you have to balance that budget. So it's a timing issue, a chicken and egg issue. Given that they don't pay taxes, while your fiscal deficit issue will also be another issue. So I simply think that, of course, your point here is that if everything that can be counted should be counted, then we're in a different world, right? But the fact is that everything has to be counted at this moment, right? Because the fact is carbon tracking of externalities are not put into the balance sheet. This is the biggest issue. This is not in the balance sheet of the private company, right? And this dichotomy will always be there. Until we solve this problem. So the first part is carbon tracking. Well, once you're able to track carbon tracking, the correct carbon pricing, right, and then everything else can go back, because then it affects the P&L of companies, it affects the bonus of CEOs, then they will have to act on it, right, not just greenwashing in the way that some of the accusers are. So the externalities, as we know in Economic 101, you're a PhD candidate, it's very difficult to price. Well, but carbon pricing will be the first step. And I think many countries, including Singapore, I'm an advisory board member of CIX, are taking the first step to price carbon correctly. Thank you.
If I could add also, I mean, you mentioned about pandemic and Russia-Ukraine war. These are incidents which do cause sentiment to change. They do not necessarily cause a change in direction. So I think it just makes people more aware that there are such considerations. Perhaps the Russia-Ukraine war will result in some permanent change in terms of supply chain. But I think in terms of the energy transition, my sense is that it will still continue. I don't see it slowing down.
I feel more confident after this afternoon. When we first started this, we did not have Miss Dr. Aisha. And that focus with Bilahari is very important as the Middle East Institute goes forward. But I can relate to what you said, Dr. Anand, that in Kuwait in 1980s, you did the first megawatt wind farm. In about that time, there were wind farms in the Sierras in California during the Reagan years because he had very good tax credits. But I'm more assured with your elongated, more even distribution because it takes time to deal with things. But why I feel very comfortable is what Dr. Tan says in terms of the commercialization direction of it, which in quantum and direction is very positive. But my question is this. So we say it's very difficult. But there is an example at the moment. In Finland, it's not energy price that's negative. It's power price that's negative. How does a country like that do that we cannot do?
The question is why in Finland they can have a power price that is negative. That's because they have a smaller population and they built the biggest nuclear reactor you can imagine. I think the challenge in Finland is probably one more of logistical supply. of absolute, because they are wealthy enough to invest in power assets, and now, of course, they can export. I don't know if you wish to add anything. He's more confident after hearing after listening to you, which is a good thing. We want people to be more confident.
Leave it at that. Because if I say something,
it may destroy your confidence. Yeah, but let's think about what we can do to reinforce this optimism. I mean, it's nice to be optimistic, but it's not good to be unrealistic.
Yeah, one of my best friends was from Finland and studied with me in Berkeley, and he's a well-to-do person. And Finland, they put their investment in the right place. What is their right investment? They invested heavily in education, number one. So once they had that education in place, like Singapore, almost the same thing, they ended up relying on the product of the education, the good education. So they came up with Nokia, and on the energy scene, they were able to make the right decisions by creating an energy system that on the one hand is very efficient, improving their efficiency, diversified in terms of sources and resources, building nuclear power plants, 1, 2, 3 after the other, including the bad one from France that is ended up tripling the cost. But that didn't dissuade them from pursuing nuclear. They have renewables in terms of wind. And so Finland is an example to study, not necessarily to emulate identical, but to draw the lessons of what are the source of success in the Finnish model, and see if you can duplicate those sources of success. If I just have a minute to make a comment about the regulation, and I think you hit it rightly, unless we develop regulation internationally that takes into consideration the interest of everybody, much of what I said will not happen. So I agree with you, and that means the Gulf countries, the small countries, the big countries, the developing countries, the North, the South, all have to put their heads together to come up with the most optimum regulation that takes into consideration the interest of everybody, but at the same time satisfy the requirement of the climate to Paris Agreement.
And before I invite Ms. Liu Xiaowei maybe to add her views on this issue of regulation, may I just say that we should not believe that this is going to be a smooth journey. Energy transition is going to be messy. It's going to be painful for some, and maybe more painful for some and less painful for some, but it will be painful for many people. The first step may be to get certain formal agreements in place, but the enforcement of those across different territories and industries, I think, will present a challenge, but that doesn't mean that we should not start by putting in place these and then seeing how we can tweak them and actually make them better. So Xiaowei, would you like to add?
Yeah, definitely. Maybe just an anecdote or something we did in Saudi Arabia about, bringing the policymakers, and more than that, your point earlier about involving diverse stakeholders. So we did a scenario-driven policy dialogue together with CAPSA, King Abdullah Center, Studies and Research Center last year. And we bring in together, very different and diverse background institutions, including 19 different institutions. This including government, civil society, industry, and investment firms, and also bring in observers to that dialogue. It is the participatory nature of the event that has the significance, where people are talking about what will be the principles for the circular carbon economy framework going forward. And it is our belief that all actors has a role to play in making important decisions for a country. And that's why this event highlighted the belief we have, as well as the advocate for location and place-based transition. precisely as speakers all mentioned earlier today, that there's no one size fits all. So that's why, we are now exploring the second phase of this work to deepen that engagement on important pathway forward. And this is one way of, demonstration of how can we embracing and include various stakeholders for important policy making and policy dialogue like this. This is just one example that we did at World Energy Council in Saudi. Maybe using the opportunity, I also like to add on, earlier we talked quite a bit about energy transition. The council has the history of 100 years witnessing different transitions. And we have, sum up some important lessons for the 100 years, and maybe still relevant for the transitions we're talking about. Number one, we think that energy is a system. So everything is interconnected, and they are interacting with each other as well. So behind every button, every switch, every fuel pump, there is a system. So there's no one thing can acting alone. Secondly, that transition is a process, not a destination, and it can't be delivered in one go. And thirdly, is energy system is very diverse and is increasing in the broadest sense. Yeah. And fourthly, the future of energy is co-created. That's why my early point about include all the important stakeholders in that journey. And technology, on the fifth point about technology, transition has to go hand in hand with societal disruption and transformation. And I'm glad, our minister mentioned this today at the very beginning, talking about reorienting economy has also have, culture and societal changes. So all the relation between energy, technology, and society will change. Yeah. So that's why we need to relook at the interactions there. The last point is really the energy system and energy transition cannot be reduced to one single matrix or number, the multi-dimension to look at energy transition. Again, that require different players to work collaboratively to define that journey forward. That's all from me. Back to you, Chairman.
Could I maybe just offer an opportunity here for some comments and maybe more questions on the subject of consumers, because that's something which we've majored a lot on how all the players should cooperate and so on, but we haven't really talked about how consumption pattern and, shall we, touched on societal change. And for the longest time we said we wanted people to pay more because it needs to be paid more in order to start the energy transition. But people were not willing to spend from their wallet. And so the energy transition gets delayed. Okay, even with subsidies or whatever, it's still delayed. So what's going to change in this aspect? Mr. Tan, would you like to hazard something on this area, and then maybe...
This is a very difficult topic, but it will be beyond our generation. It's more our children's generation. So on the way here, I asked my son, but he's a teenager, late teenager serving NS. So I asked him, how many of you guys believe that without going through a transition economy, right, you can go straight to the renewables? Right, the fact is, I think many of them in this new digital world, because of the way how Instagram and Facebook and TikTok works, right? You just keep getting the same news again. So many of them in my children's generation, our children's generation, believe that they can go straight. They can go straight without going through a transition, which I believe will be 10, 20 years of at least natural gas, to say the least. So I think there is a psychological gap between ourselves and our children. In fact, I knew of one banker. He and his daughter were working towards a SSO concert sponsored in the Botanic Garden by one of the oil major, not Mr. Lee's company. So on the way there, she was asking the father, so Papa, who is sponsoring the concert? Then he talked about this oil major. She refused to go and stop the car and go back. Refused to go. And was scolding the father why we even want to support a concert by an oil major, and it's free. Right? So I think this will be the biggest gap between, at least for me and my children, why I'm pushing for renewable in Trafigura, because I want my children to know that I do not just sell oil, I sell beyond oil. So I think it's a very difficult decision, because to the mindset of the children, right, our children generation, I think it's slightly different. Right? They can be many of them are very extreme, and yet at the same time they don't want to pay. Right? So this is the challenge for this transition. I think the transition will be longer than we think it will be. That's my personal opinion, using my children as an example. Thank you.
Well, consumer behavior or citizens' behavior is a social science that tells us people are willing to change their behavior when they are convinced that there is something in it for them. Not necessarily only financial reward, something that improves the quality of life for themselves or for their children or their society. That's number one. Number two, to help them make that decision, we need to make things on equal footing. For example, it was mentioned that without pricing carbon, it's going to be very difficult to really make that transition quickly, which is absolutely correct. But that is part of what's called internalizing externalities, because carbon is considered to be an external thing. So what you really need to do is to internalize all of the externalities that related to the energy transition, and then educate the people about it, instead of just focusing on one part and then seeing that that part works for a while, and then suddenly you discover that something else you have overlooked about the externalities are now becoming up on the scene, and now you have to reverse course and do something else. So I think it's not an easy thing, but we have to follow the tendency of human nature. Human nature tends to follow what's good for them, or for their children, or for their society. So we need to educate them and give them rational thing, and give them solution that will not be contradicted or in 5 years or 10 years. And I think we have seen a lot of this happening back and forth, to the extent, I mean, I give you an example from my own background. I'm a nuclear engineer by training, but I worked in oil and gas and other things. But the amount of misinformation that has been fed in Europe in particular about nuclear power has led to Europe essentially abandoning nuclear power, only to find out that was more or less the wrong decision, and now they're beginning to backtrack. So that's what I'm saying. You have to explain the externalities, radioactivities, cost, what have you. Explain it and factor it in nuclear power, and then compare it to fossil fuels, compare it to renewable, what have you. Now we are in the habit of saying renewable is cheapest and abundance, and that's it. But you have to factor in the cost, the life cycle cost of renewable. How do you get rid of the blades? How do you get rid of the photovoltaic, the batteries? Where are you going to get the minerals, the rare earths? All of that has, for the time being, has been ignored. So you have a direction running after renewable, almost blindfolded, and then to discover 5-10 years from now, we have major problems about renewable that have not been put on the table and expressed properly.
If I can find anybody else who would like to ask a question, then I'll come back to Aisha. Yes.
Yes, my name is George Bustin. I'm from the Middle East Institute, and I'm an absolute layman. So I have two questions, and I hope I will not scandalize the audience. The first one is, what is the proportion of oil and gas that could be used by the petrochemical industry? Because we always speak about oil and gas as a source of energy, but it is more than that. The second question is, what will happen to those countries that for the foreseeable future cannot do the transition into a green economy, so to speak. We have several countries that are almost wholly reliable for their income on carbohydrates. Who will help these countries?
Well, you asked two questions, so I'll answer the second one first, and maybe I'll leave the floor. About these countries that cannot afford it, I mean, they will need some time to make use of some of the cheap oil and gas to kickstart their economy. But if we have a limited carbon budget before we hit disaster, as I explained, that there is no room for them. So the only correct solution for that is to expand the carbon budget to allow them to do that. And the only way you can expand the carbon budget, you cannot sort of cheat nature or change mathematics or arithmetic. The only way you can do it is that by reducing the amount that you put in the atmosphere already. So if you take down, for example, out of the 2,500 gigaton that you emitted, if you take 500 gigaton over, say, 50 years, that 500 gigaton becomes available within an 1.5 degree budget. So that's how you solve that problem. Alternatively, the cost of doing that, if you don't want to do that, the cost of doing that, you can help them build renewables and build alternatives because they cannot afford to do it themselves in an accelerated budget. And ultimately, what you're going to have to do is both. So to help the developed country, and we're beginning to see some movement toward that. I gave an example that the U.S. is now becoming aware that they have to do something about their old emissions, their legacy emissions. They have to take some of it back. But the Europeans haven't come around yet to do that, but they will. I'm pretty sure that they will, because they will find there is no way that they're going to be able to do what they set out to do. I'll leave the second question or the first question to my colleagues.
I will try. So I again, it's got to do also to how different country, the carbon credit are not belong to one country, not belong to the world. If it belongs to the world, I think it's quite easier to be solved. Right? Let me explain. So, for example, to me, the lowest hanging fruit is not the transition to renewable; it's shutting down coal mines and coal power plants in the region, Indonesia, Malaysia. These are the lowest hanging fruit. Right? The banks should be incentivized to help them to shut down, right, over time, right, in a economical way, in a safe way. But no banks will be allowed to do that because it's bad for business, headline risk. But we all know that if the whole world is just to reduce carbon footprint, shutting down the coal mine in an economic manner will be, you get the most bucks out of the dollar invested. But no one in the right mind will invest in coal mine further, right, or coal power, PLNs of the world, the coal power plants, to help them to transition. But that is the easiest thing to do, right? Not to build another solar panel. Yes, it will be, but taking out coal from the system slowly, but economically and in a manner that is good for the society, I think is the lowest hanging fruit. And yet, it's very hard because, again, investment are tranched differently, investment are looked at differently, who is going to take the first loss, and more importantly, is that what Dr. Anand said, the reputational risk that a lot of companies and countries are taking. So to me, I think it's very difficult because, again, it's priced differently by different people and it's not in one pot. If it's one pot, the global, I think, will be easier to solve. That's my personal opinion. Thank you.
Let me try to answer your first question, which is around petrochemicals. Yeah, so there's a tremendous amount of research, as I understand it. I mean, I've left the industry 9 years ago. But it's tremendous amount of research going on in terms of coming up with new materials based on carbon. And in a way, you can say this is sequestered carbon, right? Because the carbon is actually not in the atmosphere, it's actually in materials. The problem is that some of this carbon is in the materials for thousands of years. And that creates other problems in terms of it's not biodegradable and so on. So the good news is that the technology is actually a design technology. So you can actually design it at the molecular level in order to get plastics that will break down, as opposed to plastics that won't break down. And there are thousands, if not millions, of permutations that you can go through in order to try and find the ideal set. They may not be the cheapest set. That's the thing. So you may need to have people pay a bit more in order to come up with this. There are also biological approaches being taken, both in terms of production as well as in the recycling of plastics, to make plastics into plastics again. But this demand for materials, whilst large, will not be able to take on the role of energy. So there's definitely a need to create an alternative energy which is based on a low or no carbon alternative. I can't give you a figure offhand how much of it goes into petrochemicals, but I can imagine that as energy moves more into low and no carbon, more fossil fuels will go into petrochemicals. And in fact, you can see this already in many of the global plants. They are converting into chemical plants as opposed to energy plants.
Number in the net zero emission scenario of the IEA, they expect demand for oil to go down from currently 100 million barrel. Most of that 100 million barrel per day is for energy. There's only less than 10% for petrochemicals and materials, what have you. And they go down to about 20 million barrels. Most of those 20 million barrels in 2050 will be for materials and plastic and what have you. With some of it will be mitigated, like into blue hydrogen or offset and what have you. So that gives you an order of magnitude, as the chairman said. The order of magnitude is quite steep. So you cannot substitute all of the 100 million barrel a day today in terms of materials. You can maybe go down from 10 million barrels to 20 million barrels, converted into material. And so for whatever is residual demand for oil, for energy, would have to be offset or decarbonized.
And even some of the low carbon energy, like blue hydrogen. I mean, blue hydrogen basically comes from natural gas. It's split in the natural gas. You still have to decide what to do with the carbon, but if you have a good technical solution for the carbon, you actually have an energy source that is still fossil-based, but doesn't release carbon into the atmosphere. That's the hope for blue hydrogen, as opposed to green hydrogen, where it's hydrolysis. It's different. I think we may be coming to the end of our time allotted, because I believe we have other speakers who are lined up and maybe waiting to come in. And we also need to give you a break, if nothing else, just for comfort. So maybe a last word from each one. Maybe we start with Xiaowei. Just a quick summation of what you would like to leave with us.
Yeah, we talked about energy transition and all that. I think there's probably a couple of things I wanted to say. Energy transitions are bumpy and messy and can be disorderly, as we already experienced that over the last 100 years in different transitions. And secondly, hearing all the discussions we have so far, I think there are constraints in the transition, the trust or mistrust, carbon budget, and timing. Timing is not in our favor to achieving Paris Agreement. These are three sort of constraints. Nonetheless, I do see, from the discussions we have, particularly around Middle East and its journey for transition, it is not just about transition, it is a leadership agenda. And as many also ask questions, collaboration at all levels are essential to making that transition faster, fairer, and inclusive. That's my points. Back to you, Chairman.
Thank you. I just came back from Central Asia, and one of the officers from our country was saying that they know a lot about us, while we do not know a lot about them. And I think with Michelle and Ambassador here helping MEI, I think we will not have this problem. And this is important for a small nation like Singapore in the Far East to reach out to the Middle East. Just like at lunch, I was talking to Madam Khadija about DBS days of setting up the banks in Middle East. Some of you may remember. I think this is now the time again to retouch all this link between Far East and Middle East. I think the Middle East want to learn from us education, civil servant, training and things like this, which I think Singapore can offer. So I think this is, as I said, it's Middle East time for the next few years, just like for APEC as well. So let's make this link really work for us. Thank you.
And Dr. Adnan?
I have nothing new to add, maybe just to leave you with the thoughts that most important that I believe in, which is really cooperation is needed. We all in this boat of energy transition together. And it is not possible for only one party or one group to decide on the direction and the speed without taking into consideration the views of the other parties. We all are aiming in the same direction. You know, I climb mountains, so whenever I set out with a group of people to climb mountains, we debate whether we should go this way or that way or this way or that way, and we choose the one that is good for all of us. That is not necessarily the best for me, but it's the best for all of us. So the goal is there, Paris Agreement, but we have to go this way or that way. We have to sit down and make compromises. If the Democrats and Republicans can make compromises on the debt ceiling and cutting the budget, and you thought a week ago they couldn't do that, I think we should be able to do that ourselves. My last point, which I keep repeating, is that whenever you have a pollution problem, there's two ways to solve the problem, not one. You stop the pollution and you remove the pollution. Stop the pollution and remove the pollution. The focus has been, for the last 20, 30 years, stopping the pollution at the expense of the developing countries. Fair enough, everybody should stop pollution, but give that some time. But we should, you know, if you have a lake and you're polluting it for 20 years, and then you realize you have to clean that lake, the first thing you do is stop polluting that lake. But if you stop polluting that lake, that's not enough. You have to remove the pollution, or at least part of it. So I leave you with those thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you all. And let me just add my thanks to my esteemed panelists. And I think it's time for break.